My name is Ina, and at 58 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing outside my son Patrick's wedding rehearsal dinner, sobbing in my car. I had sacrificed everything to raise him alone after his father died, even using my retirement savings to fund his dream wedding. But when his bride Kimberly publicly humiliated me by telling me to leave something inside me broke. That night, I made a decision that would change everything between us. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe if you've ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your dignity. I met Thomas in college, and we were married by 23. We were young in love and ready to build our life together in our small Connecticut town. When Patrick was born 2 years later, our happiness felt complete. Thomas would spin Patrick around the living room, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. We had such plans for our little family. But life rarely follows our careful plans. When Patrick was just 4 years old, Thomas collapsed in our kitchen one Sunday morning while making pancakes. A sudden heart attack took him instantly. One moment, I was a wife and mother, and the next, I was a young widow with a confused little boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Those first months were a blur of grief and panic. How would I raise our son alone? How would I keep our house? Thomas had a small life insurance policy that barely covered the funeral expenses. I had a part-time job as an administrative assistant, but nothing that could support us long-term. I remember sitting at our kitchen table late one night, bills spread before me, when I made a promise to Thomas and to Patrick. I would give our son everything I could possibly provide. I would be both mother and father to him. I would make sure his future was secure. That promise meant working 3 jobs at times. I would wake at 5 in the morning to deliver newspapers before heading to my office job. Evenings and weekends I cleaned houses or babysat for extra money. Every spare dollar went into Patrick's college fund. Patrick and I became an inseparable team. We had Friday movie nights where we would build a blanket fort in the living room and eat popcorn until our fingers turned yellow with butter. On Sundays, we would visit Thomas at the cemetery, placing fresh flowers and telling him about our week. Patrick would sit cross-legged by the headstone chatting about school or sports, as naturally as if his father were sitting beside him. As Patrick grew older, I watched him develop his father's easy charm and my determination. He was popular in school, but never arrogant about it. He worked hard, understanding from an early age that opportunities weren't handed out freely. By high school, he was helping neighbors with yard work and saving his own money alongside what I continued to put away for his education. The proudest moment of my life was watching Patrick graduate as valedictorian of his high school. When he announced he'd received a partial scholarship to Northeastern University in Boston, I burst into tears right there in our tiny living room. The savings I'd scraped together would cover the rest. Thomas would have been so proud of the young man our son had become. College meant Patrick was 3 hours away, but we spoke nearly every day. He thrived in his business program, joining clubs and making connections. When he graduated and accepted a position at a financial consulting firm in Boston, I felt like we had both accomplished something extraordinary. He had opportunities his father and I never had, and I knew Thomas was smiling down on us. Patrick visited regularly during those early professional years. He would bring me little gifts from his business trips and ask my advice about investments or workplace dynamics. He once told me that the work ethic he learned from watching me juggle multiple jobs had prepared him for the demanding pace of his consulting career. Those words meant more to me than any material success he achieved. I remained in our modest family home, eventually securing a stable management position at the same company where I had started as a temp. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I dated occasionally, but never found anyone who measured up to Thomas. Patrick became my closest family, and I was content with that. When Patrick turned 27, I felt such satisfaction in the man he had become. He was kind, ambitious, thoughtful, and deeply loyal. I had no idea that everything was about to change when he called one Sunday evening, his voice bubbling with excitement, to tell me about a woman named Kimberly he'd just met at a corporate fundraiser. Patrick had always been selective about the women he dated. In high school and college, he brought home a few girlfriends, but none of them lasted long. He was focused on his goals, and I respected that. So when he called me about Kimberly, the excitement in his voice immediately caught my attention. "Mom, I met someone incredible," he told me. "She's smart and beautiful and ambitious. She works in marketing for one of our client companies. We talked all night at this charity gala." In the weeks that followed, Patrick's calls became less about his work and more about Kimberly. They had gone hiking in the White Mountains. They had discovered a mutual love of obscure documentaries. They had the same favorite restaurant in the North End of Boston. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I was genuinely happy for him. After they had been dating for a month, Patrick invited me to Boston to meet her. I spent hours choosing the right outfit, settling on a blue dress that Thomas had always loved. I wanted to make a good impression on this woman who had captured my son's heart. We met at an upscale restaurant that made me slightly uncomfortable. Patrick had offered to pay, knowing it was well beyond my usual budget, but I insisted on contributing. Kimberly arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing breezily about a work call that couldn't wait. My first impression was of a strikingly beautiful woman with perfect blonde hair and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "It's so lovely to finally meet you," she said, air-kissing near my cheek. "Patrick has told me all about his wonderful mother." Dinner proceeded pleasantly enough. Kimberly was articulate and charming, asking questions about Patrick's childhood and commenting on how remarkable it was that I had raised him alone. But there were moments that gave me pause. When Patrick mentioned our modest holidays growing up, Kimberly laughed and said, "Well, we'll have to introduce you to real celebrations. Now won't we, darling?" Patrick just smiled and squeezed her hand. As the evening continued, I noticed how Kimberly subtly directed the conversation, cutting Patrick off mid-sentence several times. When the check came, she excused herself to the restroom, leaving Patrick to handle the bill, despite her earlier insistence on an expensive bottle of wine. These were small things, easily dismissed, but they left a faint uneasiness in my stomach. Over the next several months, I saw Patrick less and less. He moved into Kimberly's luxury apartment in downtown Boston after just 6 months of dating. When I asked if it was too soon, he assured me they were perfect together. "She challenges me, Mom," he explained. "She helps me see what I can become." Our Sunday calls became less frequent, often with excuses about Kimberly having planned something they couldn't miss. When they did visit, Kimberly would comment on my quaint home or ask Patrick why he never told her how rural his hometown was. I caught her once examining my kitchen cabinets with a slight grimace. I learned that Kimberly came from considerable wealth. Her father owned a chain of high-end furniture stores across New England, and her mother came from old Boston money. She had attended private schools and summered on Cape Cod. This background wasn't an issue in itself, but her casual dismissal of Patrick's upbringing stung me deeply. "Imagine growing up in such a tiny house," she once said, not quite under her breath, as Patrick showed her his childhood bedroom. I pretended not to hear, but the comment sat heavy in my chest for days afterward. I began to notice changes in Patrick. He replaced his practical, well-maintained car with a luxury model that Kimberly insisted better reflected his professional status. His casual, comfortable wardrobe disappeared in favor of designer labels she selected. Even his speech patterns shifted, adopting certain phrases and opinions that seemed to echo Kimberly's. When Patrick called to tell me they were engaged after just 10 months together, I forced enthusiasm into my voice while my heart raced with concern. Was this too fast? Did he really know her? But I swallowed my questions, remembering how Thomas and I had been young and impulsive too. "We're thinking about a June wedding," he told me. "Kimberly's always dreamed of getting married at the Somerset Club in Boston." When I looked up the venue later, my heart sank at the exclusivity and cost. Still, I wanted Patrick to be happy. If Kimberly was his choice, I would welcome her into our small family and do everything I could to support their marriage. A week later, Patrick called again. "Mom, Kimberly and I have been talking about wedding costs," he began awkwardly. "Her parents are contributing, but they're also helping her younger sister buy a house this year. I know it's a lot to ask, but would you be able to help with some of the expenses? I didn't hesitate. Of course, Patrick. I've been saving for your future since you were born. Whatever I can do to make your day special. What I didn't tell him was that the savings I referred to was actually my retirement fund, or that I had already calculated how much longer I would need to work to make up the difference. Some sacrifices you make silently when you love someone. At that point, I had no idea how quickly things would unravel, or that my willingness to help would be met with such shocking disrespect. The first red flags were subtle, but they were waving in the wind, warning of the storm to come. The initial wedding planning meeting took place at an upscale Boston bridal boutique where Kimberly had arranged for a private consultation. I drove up early on a Saturday morning, excited to be part of this important day in Patrick's life. When I arrived, Kimberly was already there with her mother Barbara and two friends I hadn't met before. "Ina, you made it," Kimberly said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "We've already started discussing themes. We're thinking a black tie affair with at least 250 guests." My stomach tightened at the number. "I thought you were planning something more intimate," I said, recalling Patrick's previous mention of around 100 guests. Barbara gave a tinkling laugh. "Darling, you can't have a proper wedding with fewer than 200 people. The Prestons alone are 40 guests." I didn't know who the Prestons were, but I nodded politely. Patrick arrived shortly after, looking uncomfortable in the feminine space, but eager to support Kimberly's vision. As the consultation progressed, it became clear that this wedding would be far more extravagant than I had imagined. Kimberly described elaborate floral arrangements, a 10-piece band custom monogrammed everything, and a 5-course dinner with wine pairings. The wedding planner took copious notes, while Barbara nodded approvingly. When I suggested incorporating some of the Irish traditions that had been important to Thomas's family, Kimberly smiled tightly. "We're going for a more sophisticated vibe," she said. "Nothing too ethnic or folksy." Patrick caught my eye with an apologetic look, but said nothing. That became a pattern in the months that followed. He would stand silently by as Kimberly dismissed my suggestions or excluded me from decisions, then later called to apologize privately without actually changing anything. The real shock came when the wedding planner emailed a preliminary budget breakdown. The total approached $75,000. When I called Patrick in alarm, he sighed heavily. "I know it's a lot, Mom. I've talked to Kimberly about scaling back, but this is her dream wedding. Her parents are contributing $20,000, and we're putting in $15,000 from our savings. I hate to ask, but could you manage the rest? $40,000, nearly my entire retirement fund." I sat in stunned silence, calculating what this would mean for my future. "Mom, are you still there?" Patrick's voice was anxious. "Yes, I'm here," I said finally. "I'll need to move some investments around, but I can make it work." The relief in his voice was palpable, and I couldn't bring myself to burden him with the reality of my sacrifice. As the planning continued, I found myself increasingly sidelined. Kimberly created a wedding planning group text that somehow failed to include me in important conversations. When I offered to host a bridal shower at my home, Kimberly politely declined, saying her mother had already arranged one at the country club. "You should come, of course," she added as an apparent afterthought. The exclusion hurt, but I tried to remain positive. This wasn't about me, I reminded myself. This was about Patrick's happiness. One particularly painful incident occurred when Kimberly went dress shopping. I had assumed I would be included, having mentioned several times how much I looked forward to this traditional mother-son moment. Instead, I learned about the outing through social media, where Kimberly posted photos with her mother, future mother-in-law Barbara, and 3 bridesmaids. When I called Patrick that evening, trying to keep the hurt from my voice, he seemed genuinely surprised. "She said she texted you about it," he insisted. There must have been some miscommunication, but I was beginning to suspect these weren't miscommunications at all. They were deliberate exclusions. Despite these slights, I continued writing checks for the venue deposit, for the photographer Kimberly insisted was the only one capable of capturing her vision, for the designer dress that cost more than my car. Each payment drained my account further, but I told myself it was worth it to give Patrick the wedding he deserved. In reality, I was beginning to question whether this was the wedding Patrick wanted at all. He seemed increasingly stressed during our phone calls, often mentioning disagreements with Kimberly over guest lists or wedding party expectations. Twice he hinted that perhaps they should elope, comments that Kimberly apparently found deeply offensive. "She cried for hours, Mom," he told me after one such suggestion. "She said I was trying to rob her of her perfect day." 6 weeks before the wedding, the formal invitations arrived. Mine was addressed to Mrs. Ina Wilson, with my first name misspelled as Ira. There was no +1 option, though I had mentioned bringing my close friend Susan for support. When I called Kimberly to inquire about the error, she was dismissive. "The calligrapher must have made a mistake with the spelling," she said. "And I'm sorry, but we had to make some difficult decisions about guest counts. The venue is very strict about their capacity." I later learned from Patrick that Kimberly had added 12 of her father's business associates to the guest list that same week. As the rehearsal dinner approached, I tried to maintain a positive outlook. I had a speech prepared expressing my love for Patrick and welcoming Kimberly to our family. I had my hair done professionally and bought a new dress in the sage green that Kimberly had specified for the mother of the groom. I even practiced smiling in the mirror, determined that no hint of my misgivings would show in the wedding photos. What I didn't know was that the rehearsal dinner would never make it to the wedding photos, because by the end of that evening, everything would be irrevocably changed. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled at Bistro Laurent, an exclusive French restaurant in downtown Boston that Kimberly had selected. I arrived 30 minutes early, my nerves making me punctual to a fault. I carried a small gift bag containing a silver pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas. I had planned to give it to Patrick before the wedding as his something old. The restaurant staff directed me to a private room at the back where tables were arranged in a U-shape, beautifully decorated with white roses and candles. Place cards marked each seat. I circled the tables twice before finding mine positioned at the far end of the room, nowhere near Patrick and Kimberly, who would be seated at the head table. Instead, I was placed between Kimberly's mother's tennis partner and someone listed only as Dad's client. My heart sank, but I took my seat and made pleasant conversation as other guests began to arrive. Patrick and Kimberly made their entrance 45 minutes late to applause from the now assembled guests. Kimberly wore a stunning white cocktail dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments. Patrick looked handsome in his tailored suit, but oddly tense. When our eyes met across the room, he gave me a quick wave, but didn't come over. Dinner proceeded with multiple courses of tiny, artfully arranged portions that left me still hungry. Wine flowed freely, especially at the head table, where Kimberly's father kept ordering new bottles. When it came time for toasts, Kimberly's father spoke at length about his daughter's accomplishments and how fortunate Patrick was to be joining their family. Kimberly's maid of honor gave a speech full of inside jokes that left half the room confused. When I stood to offer my prepared toast, Kimberly's father quickly interjected, "I think we have time for just one more toast from the best man before dessert arrives." The best man. Patrick's college roommate looked uncomfortable, but proceeded with his speech while I slowly sank back into my chair, the words I had so carefully prepared left unspoken. As servers cleared the dessert plates, I decided it was now or never to give Patrick his father's watch. I approached the head table where Patrick was in conversation with Kimberly's father about golf courses. "Patrick, sweetheart," I said, touching his shoulder lightly, "I brought something special for you." He turned with a distracted smile. "Oh, hey, Mom. The dinner was great, right?" Before I could respond, Kimberly swiveled in her chair. "Actually, Patrick and I need to circulate and thank our guests." Her tone was cold, her smile not reaching her eyes. "This will just take a moment," I persisted, holding out the small velvet bag. "It's something of your father's that I thought you might like to have tomorrow." Something in Kimberly's expression changed, then a flash of annoyance hardening into something uglier. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I've had enough of this," she said, her voice carrying across the now quieting room. You've been trying to insert yourself and your sad little family traditions into our wedding from day one. Patrick and I have a vision, and it doesn't include your thrift store sentimentality. I stood frozen, the velvet bag hanging limply from my fingers. The room had gone completely silent. Kimberly. Patrick started, his voice low with warning, but she cut him off. No, it's time someone said it. You're not welcome here. You've done your part by writing the checks. Now just go away and let us enjoy our wedding without your constant clingy presence. The words hit me like physical blows. I looked at Patrick, waiting for him to defend me, to contradict this horrible assessment of my role in their lives. He looked stricken, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Kimberly's father broke the awful silence with a forced laugh. Well, I think we've all had a bit too much champagne. Why don't we move on to the next part of the evening? But the damage was done. With as much dignity as I could muster, I placed the velvet bag on the table in front of Patrick. This was your father's, I said quietly. He would have wanted you to have it. Then I turned and walked steadily through the silent room, past the pitying glances and averted eyes out into the cool night air. Only when I reached my car did the tears begin to fall hot and fast down my cheeks. As I sat shaking in the driver's seat, my phone buzzed with a text from Patrick. I'm so sorry. She didn't mean it. Please come back. But another text followed immediately after, not from Patrick, but from Kimberly. This is for the best. Patrick agrees we need space from your influence. That second message clarified everything for me. This wasn't a momentary outburst. This was the culmination of months of deliberate exclusion and disrespect. And Patrick, my beloved son, who I had sacrificed everything for, had either approved this treatment or was too weak to stand against it. Something hardened inside me, then a resolve forming through the pain. I started my car and drove toward home, my mind racing with thoughts of all the checks I had written, all the vendors I had paid directly. By the time I reached the highway, my decision was made. If my only value to them was financial, then perhaps it was time to reconsider the arrangement. I had been naive to think my contributions would earn me respect or inclusion, but I wasn't powerless. Not yet. Not while my name was still on those payments. I arrived home just after midnight, emotionally exhausted, but strangely clear-headed. The humiliation I had experienced still burned, but now it fueled a determination I hadn't felt in years. I kicked off my heels and went straight to my home office, where I kept all the wedding financial documents meticulously organized in a binder. My hands were steady as I opened my laptop and began systematically reviewing what could be cancelled or refunded. Many deposits were non-refundable, but final payments for numerous vendors weren't due until the week of the wedding. I had put most of these on my credit card or had written checks that perhaps hadn't all been cashed yet. I started with the easiest cancellations. The custom welcome bags I had ordered but not yet paid for. The transportation service for out-of-town guests. The day after brunch I had arranged at a local hotel. Then I moved on to the larger items. I called my credit card company's 24-hour line and explained that I needed to dispute several recent charges. The representative was sympathetic when I explained that services had been cancelled. She flagged the charges for review and issued immediate temporary credits to my account. For the checks I had written in the past week, I contacted my bank's after-hours service and placed stop payments. There would be fees, but they were nothing compared to the thousands I would save. Throughout this process, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts and calls from Patrick. I silenced it without reading the messages. Whatever he had to say could wait until morning. Right now, I needed to protect myself and what remained of my financial security. The wedding venue had been the largest expense, with a 50% deposit already paid and non-refundable. The remaining balance, however, was due 3 days before the wedding. I drafted an email to the coordinator explaining that I would not be making the final payment as previously arranged. I knew this would effectively cancel the reservation, as their contract explicitly stated that unpaid balances would result in cancellation. The photographer, the florist, the baker, the band. One by one, I sent emails withdrawing my financial support. To each I explained briefly that circumstances had changed and I would no longer be funding these services. I suggested they contact the bride directly for alternative payment arrangements. By 3 a.m, I had systematically dismantled the financial structure of the wedding. I knew there would be consequences, angry phone calls, and probably irrevocable damage to my relationship with Patrick. But for the first time since this engagement began, I felt I had stood up for myself. I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had made that promise to Thomas years ago to give Patrick everything. I had kept that promise. I had worked multiple jobs, foregone vacations, and new clothes and dinners out. I had prioritized his education, his opportunities, his happiness above my own for decades. But somewhere along the way, giving everything had transformed from an act of love into an expectation, then finally into an entitlement. When had my son begun to see me as an ATM rather than as his mother? When had my value become measured in dollars rather than in love? My phone buzzed again, displaying Patrick's name and a text preview. "Mom, please answer. We need to talk." I finally picked up the phone and began composing a message. I wrote and rewrote it several times before settling on, "Oh, Patrick, I have cancelled my financial contributions to the wedding. I cannot and will not fund an event where I am not respected or welcome. I love you, but I will not be disrespected by you or Kimberly. When you're ready to talk, you know where to find me." I sent the message, then turned off my phone completely. There was nothing more to say tonight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, I needed rest. Before heading to bed, I retrieved the family photo albums from the living room bookshelf. I spent an hour looking through pictures of Patrick growing up. His first day of kindergarten, learning to ride a bike, high school graduation. In each photo, his smile was open and genuine, his eyes reflecting the confidence of a child who knew he was deeply loved. I wondered when that boy had disappeared, and who this stranger was, who had stood silently while his mother was publicly humiliated. Had I somehow created this by giving too much, by not demanding respect alongside the love I so freely offered? These were questions for another day. I closed the album and finally went to bed uncertain of what morning would bring, but confident that for the first time in months, I had acted to protect myself rather than to please others. Morning arrived with the harsh reality of what I had done. My phone, when I turned it back on, displayed 37 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Most were from Patrick, growing increasingly frantic through the night. Several were from Kimberly, ranging from angry demands to tearful pleas. There were even 2 from Barbara, Kimberly's mother, though I didn't bother to read those. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, mentally preparing for what would come next. I didn't have to wait long. At just after 9 o'clock, a car screeched into my driveway. Through the window, I watched Patrick and Kimberly emerge, both looking disheveled and furious. Patrick still wore his clothes from the rehearsal dinner, suggesting he hadn't been home all night. I took a deep breath and opened the door before they could knock. "How could you do this?" Kimberly demanded, pushing past me into the house. Her face was blotchy from crying her perfect hair, now tangled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Patrick followed his expression, a mix of anger and confusion. "Mom, the venue called this morning saying our reservation is cancelled. The photographer emailed saying you pulled your funding. What's going on?" I closed the door calmly and led them into the living room. "Please sit down," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I don't want to sit down," Kimberly shouted. "I want you to fix this mess you've created. My wedding is in 2 days. "Kimberly," I said quietly, "last night you made it very clear that I'm not welcome at your wedding. You told me to go away, that my only value was in writing checks. So I've removed myself completely, including my financial support. I was upset. It was just a momentary thing. You can't possibly take that seriously enough to ruin our wedding." Her voice had risen to a near shriek. Patrick put a hand on her arm. "Kim, please, let me talk to my mom." He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Mom, I know Kimberly said some terrible things last night. She was wrong, and I should have stopped her immediately. I'm sorry I didn't." but cancelling the wedding payments, that affects everyone, not just Kimberly. It was never my intention to hurt you, Patrick, I said, but I will not be treated as an ATM while being excluded and disrespected. I've spent my entire life putting you first. I used my retirement savings to fund this wedding because your happiness means everything to me. But what happened last night showed me that my feelings, my presence, even my small attempts to include your father's memory, mean nothing to either of you. Kimberly paced the room furious. This is exactly why I wanted distance from you. You're manipulative and controlling, using money to force Patrick to choose between us. I looked at her steadily. Is that what you think this is about, control? Of course it is. She spun toward Patrick. Tell her how she's been trying to come between us from the beginning, how she constantly criticizes me behind my back, how she tries to make you feel guilty for building a life with me instead of staying tethered to her. I turned to Patrick, genuinely confused. Have I ever criticized Kimberly to you? Patrick looked uncomfortable. Not directly, but you've made comments about how quickly we got engaged, about her expensive tastes. I expressed concern about the speed because I care about you, I said softly. And yes, I was shocked by some of the wedding costs because they represent years of my savings. That's not criticism, Patrick. That's the reality of my financial situation. Kimberly made a dismissive noise. Your financial situation is not our problem. If you couldn't afford it, you shouldn't have offered. Something in her callous statement seemed to affect Patrick. He looked at her with new awareness. Kim, that's not fair. My mom has sacrificed everything for me. She's not obligated to pay for our wedding at all. Well, she committed to it, Kimberly snapped. You can't just pull funding 2 days before a wedding. What about our guests? What about my dress? What about the deposits we'll lose? The same way you can't tell the mother of the groom she's not welcome at the rehearsal dinner, I asked quietly. The same way you can't, accidentally, forget to include me in dress shopping or misspell my name on the invitation. These weren't oversights, Kimberly. They were deliberate exclusions. Patrick looked stunned. What is she talking about, Kim? Kimberly's expression shifted, a calculation happening behind her eyes. She's exaggerating everything to make me look bad. You know how dramatic she can be. I walked to my desk and returned with a folder. Here are the text messages showing Kimberly told the bridal party not to include me in the dress shopping day. Here's the email where she specifically instructed the calligrapher about guest names with my name correctly spelled in her notes, but wrong on my invitation. Here's her message to me after the rehearsal dinner, saying it was for the best and that you agreed you needed space from my influence. Patrick took the folder slowly, his face paling as he reviewed the evidence. Kim, what is this? You told me your phone accidentally deleted Mom's contact for the dress shopping. You said the calligrapher made mistakes on several invitations. Kimberly's demeanor changed instantly. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached for Patrick's hand. Baby, you have to understand. Your mother has been suffocating us, trying to make our wedding about her and her sad little life. I was trying to protect our special day. Patrick pulled his hand away. By lying to me, by deliberately hurting my mother, I didn't want to upset you, she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded rehearsed to my ears. I knew how important she is to you. But once we're married, we need to start our own life without her constant interference. Interference, Patrick repeated. She's my mother, Kim, the only parent I have left. Kimberly's expression hardened again, the tears vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. It's her or me, Patrick. You need to decide right now. Either you fix this wedding situation and cut her out of our lives, or I'm done. The ultimatum hung in the air between them. I held my breath, not wanting to influence Patrick's response, but feeling the weight of the moment. Patrick looked at Kimberly for a long moment, then at me, then back to Kimberly. You've been deliberately cruel to my mother while taking her money. You've lied to me repeatedly. And now you're asking me to choose between you. I'm asking you to be a man and stand up for your future wife instead of clinging to Mommy. Kimberly spat. Patrick stood up slowly. I think you should go, Kim. Her mouth fell open in shock. What? I said I think you should go. I need some time to think about all of this. If I leave now, we're over, she threatened. Patrick nodded slowly. I think we might be anyway. With a scream of frustration, Kimberly grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard, a picture fell from the wall. In the silence that followed, Patrick and I simply looked at each other. My son's face reflected a complex mix of emotions: hurt, confusion, embarrassment, and the dawning realization of what had almost happened. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry." And then, for the first time since he was a teenager, my grown son put his head in his hands and began to cry. The days following what should have been Patrick's wedding were some of the most difficult and yet most healing of our relationship. After Kimberly's dramatic exit, Patrick stayed at my house, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, while he processed what had happened. The practical fallout was substantial. Guests had to be notified that the wedding was cancelled. Non-refundable deposits were lost. Kimberly's parents threatened legal action over the financial commitments, though their attorneys quickly backed down when presented with evidence of their daughter's behavior and the absence of any formal contract between our families. But the emotional work was far more significant. On the first evening after the confrontation, Patrick and I sat at the kitchen table with mugs of hot chocolate, just as we had when he was a child, facing a difficult situation. "I don't even know how we got here," he said, looking exhausted. "When did I become someone who would let anyone speak to you that way?" "You got swept up," I replied gently. "It happens to the best of us." He shook his head. "No, it was more than that. Looking back, I can see how Kimberly isolated me from you, from my friends, from anyone who knew the real me. She would make little comments about how my upbringing was holding me back professionally, how my clothes weren't sophisticated enough, how my attachment to you was childish. And you believed her. Not at first," he admitted, "but she was so confident, so certain about everything. She made me question my own judgment, and she could be so loving when I agreed with her, so cold when I didn't." I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That doesn't sound like a healthy relationship, Patrick." "It wasn't," he agreed, his voice breaking slightly. "I see that now. But Mum, why didn't you say something sooner? Why did you keep writing those checks when she was treating you so badly?" I considered his question carefully. "Because I wanted you to be happy, because I thought maybe I was being oversensitive, and honestly because I was afraid of losing you if I spoke up." "You could never lose me," he insisted. "But I was losing you," I said softly. "With every event, I wasn't included in every tradition that was dismissed every time you didn't stand up for me. We were growing further apart." He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of my words. "I failed you, Mom. After everything you've done for me, I failed you when it mattered most." "We both made mistakes," I said. "I should have been honest about how I was feeling instead of silently accepting the disrespect. I should have told you what the wedding was really costing me financially. We stopped communicating somewhere along the way." That conversation was the first of many over the following weeks. Patrick revealed more about his relationship with Kimberly, patterns of manipulation I hadn't been aware of, how she would criticize him privately, then praise him publicly, creating confusion about his own perceptions, how she would withdraw affection when he didn't comply with her wishes, how she had gradually convinced him that his friends were beneath his new status, his family traditions embarrassingly provincial. For my part, I acknowledged how my desire to give Patrick everything had sometimes crossed into unhealthy territory. I had prioritized his happiness over my own financial security. I had swallowed hurts rather than addressing them directly. I had enabled some of his dependent behaviors by always being the one to sacrifice. A week after the non-wedding, Patrick moved out of my house and into a small apartment across town. It was an important step for both of us, a recognition that he needed independence and I needed to rebuild my life beyond motherhood. "I need to figure out who I am without Kimberly defining me," he explained as he packed his car, "and without leaning too heavily on you." I helped him find affordable furniture and set up his new place, but I was careful not to take over the process. This was his journey now. With Patrick establishing his new life, I turned my attention to my own future. The wedding cancellation had saved me from depleting my retirement fund completely, but I still needed to rebuild my financial security. I had always dreamed of opening a small bookstore cafe, something I had put aside while raising Patrick. Now, with careful planning, I realized this dream might still be possible. I used some of the money I had saved to take a small business course at the community college. I researched locations, developed a business plan, and connected with local suppliers. The process energized me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Patrick and I established a new rhythm of weekly dinners and regular phone calls, but with healthy boundaries on both sides. He began therapy to understand the patterns that had led him into such a controlling relationship. I joined a women's group focused on self-worth and establishing boundaries. 6 months after the cancelled wedding, Patrick called with news that he had been offered a promotion that would take him to Chicago. My heart contracted at the thought of him moving so far away, but I recognized this as an important opportunity for his career and his fresh start. "Are you sure you'll be okay with me leaving?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'll miss you terribly," I admitted. "But this is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so proud of you for pursuing it." "I wouldn't go if you needed me here," he said. "Patrick, the best thing you can do for me is to build a happy, healthy life for yourself. That's all I've ever wanted." The day before he left for Chicago, Patrick helped me sign the lease on the small storefront that would become Turning Pages, my bookstore cafe. It was a beautiful moment of role reversal, my son supporting my dream, as I had supported his for so many years. As we stood in the empty space that would soon be filled with books and the scent of coffee, Patrick turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For loving me enough to let me make mistakes. For loving me enough to stand up for yourself when I couldn't. For showing me what real strength looks like." I hugged him tightly. This wonderful man I had raised, lost for a while, and found again in an unexpected way. A year later, Patrick met Sophie, a kind and genuine pediatric nurse in Chicago. When he brought her to visit me, I was struck by the easy, respectful way they interacted. There was no power struggle, no manipulation, just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Unlike with Kimberly, I didn't immediately feel on guard with Sophie. She asked thoughtful questions about my bookstore and genuinely wanted to hear stories about Patrick's childhood. She thanked me sincerely for raising such a wonderful man. When Patrick proposed to Sophie after a year and a half of dating, they planned a small intimate ceremony in Chicago with just 30 close friends and family members. The wedding was a reflection of both their personalities, simple yet meaningful. Sophie personally called me to ask if I would help her choose her dress and if I would consider giving a toast at their reception. Standing beside my son on his wedding day, watching him marry a woman who treated both him and me with genuine respect, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the painful journey that had brought us here. Had he married Kimberly, I might have lost him completely. Instead, our relationship had emerged stronger, more honest, and more balanced. Today, Turning Pages is thriving in our small town. Patrick and Sophie visit regularly, and last month they shared the news that I'll be a grandmother next spring. As I prepare the store's children's nook with new books for my future grandchild, I often reflect on the lesson we both learned through that difficult time. True love doesn't demand that you diminish yourself. It doesn't require endless sacrifice without respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for others and yourself is to establish clear boundaries. I wonder how many of you have had to make difficult choices to protect your dignity or self-worth. Have you ever had to step back from someone you loved because the relationship had become unhealthy? Please share your experiences in the comments below. And if you found value in my story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Thank you for listening. And remember that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a new beginning.